Trooper Maya Davis sat alone in her patrol car, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Outside, the parking lot of the precinct was dark, bathed only in the dim glow of a few flickering streetlights. It was just after 4 a.m., the time when most of the world was asleep, unaware of the turmoil brewing inside Maya. She stared ahead, her eyes fixed on the empty stretch of pavement before her, yet her mind was 1,000 miles away. Every inch of her body was on edge, tense with the kind of nervous anticipation that only came when a life-altering decision was at hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she shifted in her seat, trying to steady herself, but the shaking wouldn't stop. She hadn't slept in days, too restless to find peace, too tangled in her own thoughts to clear her head. The image of Sergeant Alan Brooks flashed across her mind, as it had so many times in the last few months. His face, once that of a mentor she had trusted, had become something else, a symbol of everything that had been taken from her. The humiliation, the manipulation, the power he had wielded over her, using it to bend her will, to break her spirit in ways she couldn't even name. But this was different. This was the moment she'd been dreading. The moment where she had to decide, justice or revenge. The decision was agonizing. Justice, the way she had always been taught to see it, meant following the law, holding her head high, staying true to her oath as a police officer. But how could she seek justice when the very system that had protected Alan Brooks had turned a blind eye to the pain he had caused her? Revenge was the bitter poison that had slowly crept into her thoughts, a dark temptation that whispered in the quiet corners of her mind. But it wasn't just revenge, it was something deeper. It was about reclaiming control, about finally making him pay for everything. Maya's breath caught as she exhaled, her gaze shifting to the rearview mirror. She caught a glimpse of herself, her tired eyes, her face etched with the weight of what she had lived through, and for a brief moment, she almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. This wasn't the woman she had been when she first walked into the precinct, eager to serve and prove herself. No, this was someone else, someone different, someone hardened by the endless torment she had endured under Alan's influence. Her heartbeat quickened, and she felt the familiar knot of anger tighten in her chest. The last few months had been a blur, days filled with whispered insults, sharp remarks, and the steady erosion of her dignity. Alan's advances had started slow, subtle at first, like a predator testing its prey. But soon enough, the game was no longer subtle. It had become all-encompassing. There were the late-night calls to her apartment, the cryptic texts, the moments when he'd step too close, brush his fingers against hers as if it were casual, as if she were just another woman he could control, manipulate, own. And yet, Maya had stayed silent. She had told herself it would pass, that it was just part of the job. But it didn't. It only got worse. The insults grew sharper, the moments of humiliation more frequent, until one day, she couldn't remember exactly when, it all became too much. And then came the betrayal. Maya closed her eyes, the memory flooding her all over again. Alan, his arrogant smirk, his confidence in thinking she wouldn't dare to expose him. But he hadn't counted on one thing. He hadn't counted on Maya Davis being stronger than he ever gave her credit for. She had taken the abuse, the discrimination, the near-constant bullying, but not without a cost. It had shattered something inside her, something she would never get back. The worst part? The affair. The lies. That damn test. When she found out he had been seeing someone else while they had shared moments that felt too real to be mere manipulation. It was in that moment, in the pit of her stomach, that the seed of revenge had been planted. Maya's hands tightened again around the wheel. She didn't have time to think. The decision had to be made now. She knew that if she didn't act, if she didn't confront this demon in front of her, it would consume her, break her beyond repair. Her jaw clenched. Revenge. She wasn't sure when it happened, when the idea of getting even with Alan stopped being a fantasy and started to feel like a plan. But it had. The more she thought about it, the more the plan took shape. There was a certain darkness to it, a coldness that made her stomach churn. But at the same time, it was exactly what she needed. She didn't care about the consequences anymore. She didn't care about the risk. All that mattered was making him feel the weight of what he had done. She turned the key in the ignition, the engine of the patrol car rumbling to life. It was time. Time to stop being the victim. Time to stop being the woman who had to hide behind her badge. Justice had failed her. Now, it was her turn to make things right. But as the car pulled out of the parking lot, Maya couldn't help but wonder, was this really justice? Or had she already crossed a line from which there was no return? And what would it cost her to find out? Maya's eyes remained locked on the road, the hum of the engine beneath her a steady companion to her thoughts. As the cool night air rushed in through the cracked window, her mind wandered back to a time long before the pain of Sergeant Alan Brooks had become the defining shadow of her life. Back to the beginning, to a small, cramped apartment on the south side of Chicago where everything had started. The street lights flashed by in a blur, casting brief, fleeting moments of light that seemed to echo the brief, fleeting moments of warmth Maya had experienced in her childhood. She could still see it all so clearly. The narrow alleyways, the shouts of neighbors from open windows, the constant hum of the city's energy. But it was the weight of her mother's sacrifices that filled her memories the most. Maya's mother, Jacqueline Davis, was a woman whose strength had never been in question. Raised in a world that gave her little more than the bare minimum, Jacqueline fought every day for her family. She worked multiple jobs, often late into the night, to ensure that Maya and her younger brother, Tyler, had food to eat and clothes to wear. No matter how tired she was, Jacqueline made sure there was always something warm on the stove when they came home from school. Maya watched her mother constantly, studying the way she moved through life with such purpose. There was no room for weakness, no room for self-pity in their world. Every dollar earned was hard-won, every decision made had a price. But it was the lessons Jacqueline taught her that shaped Maya more than anything. You work harder than anyone, Maya. Harder than they expect. Harder than they'll ever give you credit for. Her mother's voice echoed in Maya's mind. It wasn't just advice. It was a command. It was a way of life. Maya learned young that the world didn't owe her anything. She couldn't afford to wait for opportunities to come to her. She would have to seize them, take them, prove herself in ways that others wouldn't have to. And it wouldn't be easy, especially for a young black girl growing up in a neighborhood where the odds were stacked against her. Prejudice was an invisible weight that pressed down on her, even in the classrooms. The whispers behind her back, the dismissive stares from teachers who assumed she couldn't possibly amount to much. It was there every day, subtle but constant. In school, it was the same. The microaggressions that Maya had learned to endure, the side-eye glances that followed her every move. She'd rise to answer a question and feel the eyes of her classmates on her, some in disbelief that a black girl like her could have the answer. Maya could sense it even when it wasn't said aloud. She couldn't afford to show weakness, couldn't afford to let them see how much it stung. Every failure, every disappointment, was just another reason to keep pushing. And push she did. By the time she graduated from high school, Maya had already set her sights on something bigger. She knew that she couldn't stay in Chicago, couldn't let the environment around her dictate her future. There was more for her, more to life than the confines of a neighborhood that was slowly swallowing everything it touched. That was when she found the law. The idea of law enforcement had always seemed distant, something unattainable for someone like her. But she knew deep down that it was the one field that demanded respect. Real respect. The kind that could never be earned through pity or charity, but only through action. Her mother had taught her that, but it was her own experiences in the world that confirmed it. Maya didn't just want to serve. She wanted to be seen. She wanted to be respected, to show everyone that she was just as capable as anyone else, no matter where she came from. She was going to prove it. It was late one night, in the kitchen of that small apartment, when she told her mother her decision. Jacqueline hadn't been surprised, but there was a quiet pride in her eyes as she nodded. You can do this, Maya. Just make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. And Maya was. She wasn't just joining the force for herself. She was joining for Tyler, for every other kid growing up in neighborhoods like hers. She wanted to be a symbol, a beacon of what hard work and perseverance could achieve. But above all, she wanted to be someone who could make a real difference. At first, it was everything she dreamed it would be. The training, the structure, the discipline, it was all exactly what she'd needed. She excelled at the academy, proving to herself and everyone else that nothing could stop her. But once she hit the streets, the reality of law enforcement, the politics, the power games, began to seep through. She quickly learned that it wasn't all just about protecting and serving. The system was flawed, and not everyone played by the rules. It wasn't long before Sergeant Alan Brooks entered her life. At first, he was the mentor she'd been looking for, respected, experienced, and charismatic. He saw potential in her, pushed her to be better, to work harder. Maya admired him. He was the kind of officer she wanted to be, the kind who seemed to command authority without even trying. She couldn't have known then how quickly that admiration would turn into something else, how her blind trust would soon be shattered in ways she couldn't even fathom. She had joined the force to prove herself, to be more than the circumstances she had been born into. But in the end, it wasn't the job that nearly broke her. It was the man who had once seemed like her greatest ally. Sergeant Alan Brooks, a man who used his position to destroy everything she had worked for. Maya's thoughts snapped back to the present as a patrol car rumbled down the road, heading toward a place she could no longer escape. The world outside blurred into the background, but the truth of her past, of everything that had led her to this moment, was undeniable. She had fought to get to where she was, and now, for the first time, she realized that the fight was far from over. Maya's journey through the ranks of the police force was anything but easy. Every day was a battle, and it wasn't just the criminal she had to face. She had to fight the weight of expectations and prejudices that had been ingrained in the department long before she ever stepped foot inside. The male-dominated, predominantly white world of law enforcement was a far cry from the idealistic image she had once held. From the moment she pinned on her badge, Maya knew she would have to prove herself more than anyone else. The other officers, especially the men, saw her not as an equal, but as a curiosity. They didn't think she belonged, didn't believe she had earned her place. She was a black woman in a uniform, in a profession that had been built by and for white men. They expected her to fail, and for a time, it seemed like they were determined to make sure she did. At the precinct, there was a certain coldness that met her at the start of every shift. It was the look in their eyes, the way they would exchange glances behind her back. "She's not cut out for this," they'd whisper. It wasn't just about her gender, it was about her race, too. She wasn't given the same chances, the same respect, and yet she never backed down. In fact, she worked harder than anyone to prove she belonged. Maya stayed late, going over paperwork until her eyes blurred, running extra drills to improve her skills. She never complained, never made excuses. There was no room for weakness, and she knew that the only way she could show them she deserved to be there was by being better than they could ever expect. With each passing year, Maya rose through the ranks, her skills on the streets earning her the respect of a few officers who began to see her potential. She wasn't just the token anymore, she was the one they called on when things went south. Her reputation for quick thinking, fearlessness, and decisive action in high-pressure situations began to build. She saved lives. She stopped crimes in progress. She earned commendations for bravery, accolades that carried weight and made even her harshest critics pause. Maya Davis was not to be underestimated. But despite the increasing recognition, there was one officer whose presence had begun to shape her career in ways she hadn't anticipated. Sergeant Alan Brooks. Maya had first met Alan on her third day on patrol. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen it all. His experience and reputation preceded him. Alan was the kind of officer everyone respected, some feared, but one who rarely cracked a smile. He was all business, a man who lived by the rules, or at least, that's how he appeared. At first, Alan seemed like the perfect mentor. He took an interest in her development, offered advice, and even acknowledged her bravery on a few occasions. Maya felt as though she'd finally found someone who could guide her through the mire of politics within the department. But soon, it became clear that there was more to Alan than met the eye. While he appeared to be a leader, someone who set high standards, he also saw himself as a gatekeeper, a man with the power to decide who would rise and who would stay in the trenches. Alan didn't see Maya as a colleague. To him, she was a project, someone to mold, and not entirely in a way that would benefit her. At first, Maya wasn't sure what to make of the way Alan would sometimes pull her aside during briefings, his voice lower than usual, offering pointed comments that seemed to undermine her confidence. He'd ask questions that subtly doubted her capabilities, or suggest actions she knew weren't in line with protocol. Over time, she realized that it wasn't that he didn't believe in her. Rather, it was that he needed her to believe in him, and in a very specific way, as someone who held the power to determine her worth in this department. Alan didn't make his dominance known through open displays of aggression, though. Instead, it was the quiet manipulation, the way he would praise her publicly but always in a manner that made it clear he was the one responsible for her success. In meetings, he'd throw her under the bus in front of superiors with a casual comment. "Maya's got potential," he'd say, eyes scanning her with a barely there smirk. "But she still has a lot to learn." And it wasn't just the small remarks. There were the moments when he'd send her on impossible assignments, tasks designed to stretch her thin, to make her doubt herself. "I need you to handle this, Maya," he'd say. "It's a test." She quickly realized it wasn't really a test of her abilities, but rather of how far he could push her without crossing a line. Still, Maya endured. She had to. There were no options. Leaving the force was not something she could afford. She'd come too far. So, she pushed herself harder, constantly walking the line between impressing Alan and holding on to her own self-respect. But as much as she tried to rise above, the weight of his manipulation began to wear on her. Each slight, each criticism, each subtle move from Alan making her feel smaller than she really was. Yet, despite the strain, Maya had one thing Alan couldn't take away from her: her tenacity. She began to see through his games, though she knew better than to challenge him openly. Instead, she would use his manipulation to her advantage, learning how to play the game better than he ever could. But that only made him more insistent, more relentless in his attempts to control her. Still, through it all, Maya remained sharp, undeterred in her mission. She had come too far to let one man stand in her way. She knew her worth, and she was willing to fight for it, no matter the cost. But the tension between them, the power he wielded over her and the will she had to break free, was starting to build to a breaking point. Alan Brooks may have thought he controlled the situation, but Maya was starting to see the cracks in his armor. She wasn't the same young recruit who'd walked into this department years ago. She was stronger, smarter, and ready to fight back, whether Alan knew it or not. And soon enough, she would have the opportunity to prove just how far she was willing to go to protect herself and her career from the man who had, for so long, tried to control her fate. But Maya wasn't finished with Alan Brooks. Not by a long shot. Sergeant Alan Brooks walked into the precinct like a man who owned the place. His uniform was crisp, his posture straight, and his presence filled the room in a way that made everyone pause and take notice. He was the epitome of a seasoned officer, confident, respected, and a man who could command attention without raising his voice. Alan was the kind of leader officers admired and feared in equal measure. His reputation was built on years of experience, years spent making tough decisions and facing dangerous situations. He had a natural authority that drew people in, and in a department like this, that was something rare. He seemed to know exactly what to say to make his team feel both supported and intimidated. When he spoke, his words carried weight, and when he commanded, his orders were followed without question. To his peers, Alan was everything a sergeant should be. He was the one they turned to for advice, the one they trusted to lead them into difficult situations. His leadership was admired, and his ability to keep a cool head in the face of chaos was legendary. No one doubted that Sergeant Alan Brooks was the man who held everything together. He had the uncanny ability to make people feel both seen and disposable at the same time, a talent that earned him respect but also instilled fear in anyone who worked under him. But beneath the polished exterior, there was another side to Alan Brooks that few could see. The manipulation, subtle yet insidious, was a part of his charm, a hidden weapon he wielded against those who were closest to him, particularly women like Maya. He didn't need to shout or make threats to get what he wanted. Instead, he played on insecurities and desires, preying on the vulnerabilities of those who trusted him most. Maya had always admired Alan, at first. He had the kind of authority she respected. His guidance had seemed genuine, his advice helpful. At first, he treated her like a mentor, helping her navigate the complexities of the department. He was the one who taught her the tricks of the trade, who pushed her to become better. She admired his dedication, his ability to remain calm in chaotic situations. For a time, he was a pillar of support, an example of what she aspired to be. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, his behavior began to shift. He no longer just offered advice. He began to offer compliments that bordered on personal. At first, they seemed harmless enough, a comment on her appearance, a lingering glance when they spoke. But then came the moments that made her uncomfortable. At briefings, Alan would place a hand on her shoulder, just a little too long, or brush against her in ways that felt more intimate than professional. He would make jokes about her strength, about how she could handle anything because she was one of the guys, but the tone had a double meaning. His compliments were praiseworthy on the surface, but underneath, they always carried a hidden message, a subtle power play that Maya began to notice more and more. The verbal jabs came next. He'd mock her decision-making in front of the team with a raised eyebrow and a sarcastic remark. He'd call her out for small mistakes, making them seem much bigger than they were. He would comment on her lack of experience, as if she were constantly falling short. Every time he did, his tone would shift from playful to cutting, and she could feel the sting of his words far longer than she should have. It wasn't just about the comments, though. Alan started to find ways to push boundaries, to make Maya feel small, even in front of her colleagues. He'd place her in difficult situations, assigning her tasks that seemed nearly impossible, tasks that were often meant to show her weaknesses. And when she struggled, as she sometimes did, he was always there, ever present, watching her fail. But it wasn't just the emotional manipulation that set the stage for Alan's true nature. There were the quiet moments, the ones that nobody else saw. Maya would be walking through the parking lot after a long shift, and Alan would pull up beside her in his patrol car, offering a ride. He'd wait for her to accept, and when she hesitated, he'd smile that charming, reassuring smile that made it hard to say no. It was in those moments that Maya began to see something different in Alan, a man who used his power as a sergeant to get closer to her, to gain access to her emotions and, eventually, her trust. As much as Maya tried to hold him at arm's length, she couldn't escape the reality that Alan was the one person who could make or break her career in this department. He was too powerful, too influential. He knew too much. But even worse was the way he gradually turned those manipulations into advances. The lines between mentorship and something far more dangerous began to blur. He would show up at her apartment late at night after a difficult case, offering to talk it over, despite her clear disinterest. When she began to pull away, when she started to assert her boundaries, he escalated, using subtle intimidation disguised as concern. In time, Maya realized the truth about Alan Brooks. He didn't see her as an equal. He saw her as a tool, something to mold, something to control. His leadership wasn't about building a strong team. It was about maintaining dominance, making sure everyone beneath him understood their place. And with Maya, it became clear. Her place, in his eyes, was to be subjugated, to fall in line, to accept his authority. Alan didn't just manipulate her career. He sought to manipulate her sense of self, her worth. He pushed and pulled her emotionally, taking advantage of her vulnerabilities, and then playing the role of that helpful, protective sergeant when she needed it most. He was a master of balancing support with oppression, keeping her just close enough to feel safe, while maintaining the distance necessary to hold the power in their relationship. As the months went by, the tension between Maya and Alan grew. He was always one step ahead, always watching, always subtly undermining her confidence, always making her feel as if she owed him something. And Maya, despite her growing suspicion, couldn't quite put her finger on it. She wanted to trust him, she had no choice but to trust him. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Alan's manipulations weren't just an inconvenience. They were the beginning of a pattern that would shape Maya's future in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. In the end, Alan Brooks wouldn't just become a mentor. He would become the catalyst for everything that followed. His control, his abuse of power, would set Maya on a path she never anticipated, a path that would test everything she thought she knew about herself and the world around her. Maya's decision was made. She could feel the weight of it, heavy and irrevocable, pressing against her chest as she sat alone in her apartment that night. The TV played softly in the background, but the flickering images were little more than noise. The silence in her mind was deafening. She had spent months grappling with her feelings, first betrayed, then humiliated, and finally, broken. Alan Brooks had taken everything from her, the trust, the safety of her workplace, and, more painfully, her health. There had been a time when she had looked up to him, admired him, even sought his approval. But that person was gone, replaced by someone who had no more use for the man she had once respected. He had shown her exactly what kind of monster he was, and now, Maya understood that justice would never come from the system. It wouldn't come from anyone else. The months following Maya's diagnosis were filled with tension. She had suffered through the humiliation and betrayal, had stewed in her anger, but now she was ready to take control. She spent sleepless nights running over every detail in her mind, planning how she would execute her revenge. The emotions that had been building inside her now became a cold, calculating determination. Alan Brooks had made her life unbearable, but now, it wasn't him she sought to punish. Sergeant David Ross had been another obstacle in her career. He, too, had played a part in her downfall, though his methods were more subtle, a mix of manipulation and disregard. Ross had been an ally of Alan, even before the abuse. He'd watched from the sidelines as Maya struggled, only to secretly undermine her at every turn. He wasn't as overtly predatory as Alan, but he had a knack for using his position to push Maya down, offering her the false hope of promotions only to pull them away at the last moment, making her believe she wasn't good enough. He played games with her career, weaponizing his power over her for his own amusement. Maya had endured this for years, each slight eating away at her. But the breaking point had come when Ross began offering her personal advice under the guise of mentorship. It started with casual compliments, a hand on her shoulder, a lingering look. But soon enough, the behavior escalated into whispers during late shifts, the promise of a reward for loyalty and hard work, and the eventual manipulative power play that nearly cost her everything. And that's when Maya knew her revenge would come, not for Alan, but for Ross. Alan was merely the catalyst. Ross, the one who thought he could break her spirit, would be the one to feel the weight of her vengeance. Maya's plan was meticulous. It was about rebuilding trust, regaining control over the narrative, and creating an opportunity where Ross would let down his guard. She had to make him believe she had forgiven him, that the years of mistreatment and games were all in the past, that she was willing to move forward. Only then would she have him where she needed him. Day by day, Maya played the part. Her interactions with Ross were carefully calculated. She would respond to his comments with just the right balance of respect and indifference, making sure he thought he was making progress, that his manipulation was working. She smiled, nodded, and let the illusion of normalcy settle in. After all, Maya was a professional. She could play the game as well as anyone. It was late in the week when Maya finally made her move. She had spent months carefully constructing her alibi, keeping her distance from her colleagues when necessary, and preparing for this night. David Ross was particularly vulnerable that evening, distracted by personal issues, agitated by a failed internal investigation, and emotionally reckless. He reached out to Maya for the one thing she knew he needed, validation. It was exactly what she'd been waiting for. The night unfolded slowly. Maya had never been inside Ross's apartment before, but tonight, everything felt different. He was sloppy, distracted, vulnerable in a way that he rarely was in the office. Maya had anticipated this. He would be the one who made the move, who let down his defenses, and she would be the one to act. As expected, Ross invited her inside under the guise of discussing work. She played her part, pretending to be earnest, pretending to listen as he went on about the case that had him so rattled. But she knew better than to let herself get lost in his words. She focused on the space between them, every step he took, every gesture. She had studied him too long to fail now. Ross poured them both a drink, and they spoke for a few more minutes. Maya let the tension between them grow, savoring the sense of control she had worked so hard to regain. Finally, after the smallest of smiles, he leaned in closer, touching her arm, a touch that had become all too familiar over the years, but now it was different. It was a bridge she was ready to cross. "I've always believed in you, Maya," Ross murmured. "You've got so much potential. If you'd just relax, let yourself go, you'd see it too." She could feel his hand on her arm, could see the flicker of expectation in his eyes. He wanted something from her, something she would never give freely, but something she was about to take from him in the most profound way. In a flash, Maya moved with precision. The act itself was quick, calculated, and almost surgical. She had prepared for this moment, and it was no longer about how she felt. It was about the satisfaction of seeing his arrogance and manipulation crumble. As their brief encounter came to an end, Maya's heart did not race with the thrill of victory. Instead, there was a hollow emptiness that settled in her chest. She had won, but it felt like nothing. The rush of revenge was absent, drowned out by the realization that nothing would ever undo the damage that had already been done. She watched Ross, now vulnerable and unaware, begin to regret his actions. But Maya felt no satisfaction. The emotional disconnect was all-consuming. What she had hoped would feel like justice only reminded her of the price she had paid for it. Her integrity, her soul, and her own sense of self. The act of revenge had become her prison. As Maya stepped out of Ross's apartment, the cool night air hit her, and she felt nothing but cold emptiness. There was no redemption in revenge. There was no closure. She had become what she had once hated. And now, as she walked away from the life she once knew, Maya realized that there were no winners in a game like this. After the encounter, Maya left Sergeant David Ross's apartment feeling nothing but cold emptiness. The calculated vengeance had been carried out, but in its wake, a heavy silence seemed to settle over her, an unsettling quiet that mirrored the chaos inside her. For the first time, she questioned what her actions had truly achieved. But the consequences of what she'd done were only beginning to unfold. David Ross had always been a man of control, never one to show vulnerability. But in the days that followed their encounter, something began to change. His usual composure faltered, replaced by an unease that he couldn't ignore. At first, it was subtle, a mild headache, fatigue that lingered longer than usual. Ross tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to the stress of his work, the mounting pressure he faced from the higher-ups. But as the days wore on, the symptoms intensified. The dizziness became more pronounced. His body ached, his joints stiffened. He struggled to focus at work, his energy waning as his appetite disappeared entirely. It wasn't just the physical toll. It was the nagging suspicion that something was wrong. Something wasn't adding up. His mind began to race. What had happened that night? His memory was foggy, but certain details stood out, details that made his skin crawl in hindsight. Maya. He had seen the look in her eyes, the way she seemed so detached. It was almost as if she was playing a game, one that he hadn't realized he was part of until it was too late. He started to connect the dots. There had been no obvious signs before that night. And now, just days after their encounter, his condition had rapidly deteriorated. David couldn't ignore the nagging fear that something more sinister than a mere cold or stress was at play. His instincts told him that he had been betrayed. But by whom? And how? He didn't yet know. But his suspicion was growing, inching closer to something he couldn't easily dismiss. Whispers began to circulate in the precinct as Ross's behavior grew more erratic. Officers started to notice the change in him, the way he'd snap at colleagues for no reason, how he seemed distracted, unsteady on his feet. He had always been the picture of authority, but now he was showing cracks, and it wasn't long before people started talking. "Did you see Sergeant Ross today? He looked like he was about to pass out," one officer remarked in hushed tones in the break room. "I heard he's been in and out of the doctor's office lately." "Something's wrong. I don't know what," another officer muttered, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one else was listening. Rumors quickly spread throughout the department. Whispers about Ross's mysterious illness and his increasingly strange behavior. Some speculated it was stress, others thought it was some sort of addiction. But there were murmurs of something darker, something they couldn't quite put their fingers on. And in the middle of it all, Maya couldn't escape the growing weight of her actions. She had carefully orchestrated this moment, manipulated Ross into a position where he was vulnerable, where she could strike and take her revenge. But now, as the days passed, she couldn't shake the gnawing anxiety that had begun to take root inside her. The first morning she saw Ross after their encounter, he looked different. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his movements were sluggish. He wasn't the man she had once seen as a powerful figure. He was something less now. Maya's stomach churned with a sense of guilt that she couldn't push away. Every time their paths crossed, she saw the cracks in his facade, the physical evidence that he was sick, that her revenge had taken a toll on him in a way that was irreversible. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel something close to satisfaction. He deserved this, she thought. After everything he had put her through, the manipulation, the false promises, the emotional torment, he was finally paying for it. But the satisfaction was fleeting, overshadowed by a creeping dread. What if he found out? What if he suspected her? Maya knew she had been careful, had made sure to cover her tracks, but even the smallest misstep could ruin everything. The worst part was that Maya couldn't even turn to anyone. She had always been the lone wolf in the precinct, keeping her emotions and her thoughts tightly guarded. But now, with Ross's health deteriorating, Maya found herself trapped in her own web of lies. Every time someone mentioned his illness, her heart would race, and she'd force a smile, pretending to be just as clueless as the rest of them. But inside, the walls were closing in. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. Every passing second felt like an eternity. What if Ross made the connection? What if he figured out what she had done? What if he confronted her? Maya began to replay the events of that night over and over in her head, trying to recall every detail, every movement, every word. She had been careful, she was sure of it, but doubt had begun to creep in. The weight of her actions, the irreversible nature of what she had done, was beginning to sink in. Her life, her career, everything was now tied to the fallout of that single decision. The consequences of her revenge, once so sweet in her mind, had become an unbearable burden. And then there were the rumors. Maya's anxiety grew with each passing day. She could feel the tension in the air, could hear the hushed conversations behind her back. Every glance, every whispered word, felt like a threat, a reminder of what she had done. Ross's condition worsened. He began to pull away from the department, taking medical leave under the guise of an unspecified illness. But no one believed the official line. Everyone knew something was wrong. The whispers grew louder. Was it possible? Had he been infected? If so, how? And why? It didn't take long for the pieces to start falling into place, for suspicions to mount. Slowly, the story began to take shape, a story that Maya feared would soon be uncovered. And all the while, she struggled to breathe, the weight of her own guilt crushing her. Her revenge had been swift, and it had been effective. But now, it was haunting her. She had achieved what she set out to do, but at what cost? The repercussions, the consequences, were far greater than she had ever anticipated. As the rumors swirled and David Ross's condition became more serious, Maya knew the truth was coming, just not in the way she had imagined. And as much as she wanted to ignore it, as much as she wanted to pretend that nothing had changed, she knew one thing for certain. There would be no escaping the fallout. As the days dragged on, the quiet undercurrent of suspicion that had surrounded David Ross's condition erupted into full-blown public scrutiny. His rapidly declining health had been hard to ignore, and soon, whispers became headlines. What had once been a private matter, a mysterious illness that no one dared to fully acknowledge, was now a spectacle for the entire city to witness. The news outlets were relentless. Police Sergeant's mysterious illness sparks investigation flashed across screens, and in a matter of days, Ross's private battle became the subject of every conversation. As his condition worsened and the department continued to issue vague statements, the public began to demand answers. The first major breakthrough came when a doctor leaked to the press that Ross had tested positive for HIV. It wasn't just any illness. It was the kind of virus that could ruin reputations and careers in a flash. How had it happened? Who had infected him? The questions seemed endless, the answers elusive. The suspicion surrounding Ross's sudden and unexplained illness didn't just affect his personal life. His position as a high-ranking officer now came under intense scrutiny. His peers began to wonder, to speculate. Had the infection been contracted through a work-related incident? The notion felt absurd to some, but it was enough to trigger an investigation. And as the details of the inquiry began to unfold, it didn't take long for suspicion to land on Maya. Maya had been careful, meticulously careful, when carrying out her plan. She had ensured there were no physical traces, no evidence that would directly tie her to Ross's condition. But in the world of police work, nothing stayed hidden forever. The investigation itself was swift, methodical, and incredibly invasive. Ross's medical history was combed through, his sexual partners questioned, and his movements examined with a microscope. Maya's name surfaced almost immediately. Her proximity to him, the sudden breakdown in their professional relationship, the rumors of their late-night encounters, it all pointed toward her. The Internal Affairs Division started asking questions, and though she had made every effort to distance herself from any trace of wrongdoing, the question lingered, could Maya have been responsible? With the investigation came the media frenzy. HIV in the precinct, Police Sergeant's shocking diagnosis raises more questions, was the headline of one article. Another headline read, female officer under investigation after Sergeant contracts HIV. The reporters were relentless, tracking down former colleagues, neighbors, and anyone who might offer a glimpse into Maya's life. Some speculated that Ross had contracted the virus due to his promiscuous behavior. Others pointed to the toxic culture within the police department, where harassment and abuse were known but rarely spoken of. But amid the speculation, there were factions that rallied behind Maya, defending her as a victim in her own right. Social media erupted with hashtag campaigns such as #JusticeForMaya, with many followers speculating that Ross had used his position of power to exploit her, to break her down emotionally. To them, Maya was simply taking control of her life after years of suffering under an abusive superior. But for others, the lines were much blurrier. Was Maya justified in her revenge? Was it self-defense? Or was it something darker, something premeditated? Opinions were split, and with every new revelation, the debate became more heated. As the media circus unfolded, the legal system began to take its own course. The department initiated an official investigation into Ross's medical condition, but the legal process quickly spiraled into something far larger, more complex. Maya found herself at the center of a legal maelstrom. Maya's legal team was forced to prepare for a case that was not only about her actions but about the broader issues of police corruption, sexual abuse, and power dynamics within the force. Courtroom drama became its own spectacle, with the investigation into Ross's condition forming the basis of an emotionally charged trial. Maya sat in the defendant's chair, her face calm, but her hands trembling slightly. This was the moment she had feared, the moment when everything she had done would be exposed under a glaring spotlight. Her defense attorney argued that Maya had acted out of a deep sense of justice after years of suffering under an abusive superior. They painted a picture of a woman driven to take control of her own narrative after being subjected to unspeakable trauma. On the other side of the aisle, Ross's legal team fought back fiercely. They claimed that Maya's actions were deliberate, premeditated, and intended to destroy Ross's career and life. The prosecution painted Maya as a woman who had crossed the line between victimhood and vengeance, one whose actions were far beyond any justification. They called witnesses who spoke of her once strong relationship with Ross, of the mentorship he had provided, and the trust that had once existed between them. This only made the betrayal seem all the more personal and horrifying. The courtroom was filled with drama and tears as former colleagues and fellow officers took the stand. Some of them, once close to Maya, testified that she had changed, becoming distant, angry, and withdrawn after a certain event had transpired. Others spoke of seeing the emotional toll that Ross's treatment had taken on her, but none had the courage to speak out at the time. There were emotional testimonies from both sides. One officer, a former friend of Maya's, recalled how she had been a rising star within the department, ambitious, talented, and driven. But as time passed, he had seen her struggle with Ross's increasingly inappropriate behavior. He noted how she had begun to lose her self-confidence, how she seemed to withdraw into herself. On the opposite side, a colleague of Ross's testified about his dedication to the department, his drive to lead by example. But the moment the defense began to suggest that Ross had used his position to exploit Maya, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The prosecution's case began to lose its grip on the jury, as doubt seeped in. Was Maya, as the defense claimed, truly a victim of abuse? Or had she been manipulated by her own desire for retribution? The trial dragged on for weeks, with each witness adding a new layer of complexity to the case. In the end, it was clear that the public's opinion was divided. Some saw Maya as a woman who had been pushed beyond her limits, and some saw her as a cold-hearted perpetrator of revenge. What was undeniable, however, was that both Maya and Ross had been victims in their own ways. Maya had suffered abuse at the hands of an authority figure, and Ross, despite his abuse of power, was now facing the irreversible consequences of his own actions. The media continued to feast on the drama unfolding in the courtroom. The headlines shifted, but the public's thirst for answers remained unquenched. Everyone was watching, everyone was waiting, for the final decision, the resolution of the case, and for the question that remained. Was this act of revenge truly justified, or had Maya crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? The courtroom was eerily quiet as the judge delivered the verdict, his voice steady and impartial, as if weighing not just the evidence, but the lives of those involved. Maya Davis sat rigid in her chair, her heart pounding in her chest, each breath shallow as she awaited the final judgment. The months of anticipation, the twists and turns of the trial, had led to this defining moment. The jury had deliberated for what felt like an eternity. But in the end, they had reached a unanimous decision. Maya was convicted of knowingly transmitting HIV to Sergeant David Ross. Despite the defense's impassioned argument that Maya had acted out of revenge and desperation, the jury determined that her actions, though emotionally driven, had crossed a legal line. As the gavel came down, the weight of the verdict crashed over Maya like a wave. The words, "guilty as charged," echoed in her ears, though they barely seemed real. She was numb, unable to process the sheer finality of it all. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in around her, as if the air itself had thickened in response to the verdict. Maya's lawyer stood beside her, the words of the sentence fading into a blur. She heard the brief, formal mention of her sentence, a lengthy prison term, one that would strip away the very future she had fought so hard for. There would be no more nights patrolling the streets, no more dreams of promotion or redemption. This was it. Her career, her life as a police officer, was over. While the courtroom's focus was on Maya, the fallout from Sergeant Alan Brooks's scandal was far from over. Though he had escaped legal repercussions, the damage to his career was irreparable. The media had painted him as both a predator and a victim, and the public's view of him had soured beyond repair. The whispers about his abusive behavior grew louder, reaching the ears of those who had once admired him. His colleagues, who had once seen him as a strong, charismatic leader, began to distance themselves. Alan's professional life crumbled, his influence in the department shattered. Promotions and honors that had once seemed assured for him were now out of reach. He was relegated to the sidelines, a cautionary tale of what can happen when power and corruption intertwine. Yet, despite the damage to his career, Alan was not sentenced. There would be no prison time for him, no legal consequences for the part he had played in the toxic environment that had ultimately led to Maya's actions. He was left to face only the fallout of his professional reputation, a public figure tainted by scandal. As the jury's verdict was announced, Alan's expression remained stoic, but a flicker of something darker passed over his face. His role in the situation had been dismissed by the courts, but in his heart, he knew that the damage had been done. Maya had acted. She had taken her revenge in the only way she knew how, and now, the consequences were irreversible. For Maya, the months of waiting for a sentence had felt endless. Each day, as the trial progressed, she wondered if this day would ever come. And now that it had, it was far more devastating than she could have imagined. The military prison sentence was a harsh one, far harsher than she had anticipated. No more field work, no more nights under the badge. The life she had once dreamed of, the aspirations that had driven her for so long, were now reduced to memories. As Maya was escorted out of the courtroom, her mind spun in a fog of emotion. Anger, regret, a deep, hollow sense of loss. In that moment, she could no longer distinguish the emotions that had driven her to this point from the ones she felt now. Her heart, once filled with a desire for justice, now felt like an empty, broken vessel. Outside the courthouse, the media circus raged on. Cameras flashed as reporters called out questions, attempting to capture Maya's last moments of freedom. She didn't acknowledge them. There were no words left to say, no justification that would make sense of the choices she had made. The reality was simple. She had chosen revenge, and in doing so, had paid the price. As Maya was led toward the waiting transport vehicle, she caught a fleeting glimpse of Alan across the crowded street, standing near the edge of the sidewalk. His eyes met hers for a brief moment. An unspoken understanding passed between them, but there was no satisfaction in that look, no sense of closure. Instead, it was as if the events that had unfolded had been nothing more than an irreversible sequence of actions, each one feeding the next until it had all ended in destruction. For Maya, the sentence was more than just a legal punishment. It was the severing of a chapter in her life, a painful recognition that the path she had chosen would lead her to a different future, one filled with regret, and one without the career she had once dreamed of. The gavel had fallen. The case was closed. But for both Maya and Alan, the real consequences, the emotional aftermath, the sense of what was lost, would continue to haunt them for the rest of their lives. The law had spoken, but in the silence that followed, it was clear. This was no simple story of justice. This was a tragedy, for both the victim and the perpetrator, and for a system that had failed them both. In the end, the question was no longer about right or wrong, guilt or innocence. It was about the price of vengeance, the price of a soul broken beyond repair. Maya sat alone in her cell, the cold concrete walls closing in around her as the harsh fluorescent lights above hummed softly. The days blurred together, one indistinguishable from the next, but the silence was deafening. The weight of her actions, the choices that had led her to this moment, pressed on her chest like a suffocating force. It was impossible to ignore the gnawing emptiness that had settled in her heart, the hollow ache that she couldn't seem to shake, no matter how hard she tried. In the stillness of her isolation, Maya began to reflect on the decisions that had shaped her downfall. She thought back to the woman she had once been, the young officer full of ambition and idealism, eager to prove herself and make a difference in the world. The moment she had taken that first step into law enforcement, she had hoped to build a career based on justice, integrity, and strength. But somehow, somewhere along the way, that path had diverged into something darker, driven by a thirst for revenge rather than righteousness. She couldn't help but replay the events leading to her conviction, the way her anger and betrayal had consumed her, clouding her judgment. The pain of what had happened to her, the abuse, the manipulation, had been so overwhelming that it had seemed like the only answer was retribution. But now, sitting in this cell, alone with her thoughts, she realized how misguided she had been. The revenge, the act that had once felt like a form of justice, had not healed her. It had not righted the wrongs done to her. It had only perpetuated the cycle of hurt. It had created new wounds, not just for her, but for others involved in the mess she had made. The idea of getting back at Alan had been her driving force for so long, but as the reality of her situation set in, she understood the truth. Revenge hadn't been the answer. It hadn't fixed her. It had broken her further. And now, she was paying the price, alone in a prison cell, with nothing but her thoughts to keep her company. In the months following her conviction, Maya began to participate in therapy, at first reluctantly, but eventually with a sense of purpose. The prison's counseling program was far from perfect, but it gave her a space to confront the emotions she had buried for so long. Her therapist, a seasoned counselor who had seen her share of broken lives, guided her through the process of unpacking the trauma and resentment that had festered inside her for so long. There were days when Maya wanted to give up, when the weight of her regret seemed unbearable, and the thought of facing the truth about her own actions felt like an insurmountable obstacle. But slowly, piece by piece, she started to understand. She had been a victim of abuse, yes, but in choosing vengeance, she had become the perpetrator of more harm she couldn't undo. Through therapy, Maya started to confront the toxic cycle of abuse and power that had shaped her life and the way it had shaped her choices. She learned to acknowledge the pain that had been done to her without allowing it to define her. It was a long, difficult journey, but with each breakthrough, she felt a little lighter. The anger that had consumed her began to fade, replaced by a deeper understanding of herself and the consequences of her actions. But it wasn't just therapy that helped Maya start to heal. She began to find solace in helping others, particularly those who had experienced abuse like she had. In the prison's support groups, she became an unlikely mentor to a few of the other women. Many of them had been victims of systemic injustice or had faced manipulation and violence from people in positions of power. Maya's story resonated with them, and in turn, they began to open up to her. She listened. She shared. She offered what little wisdom she had gained through her own suffering. The irony wasn't lost on her. In giving to others, in sharing her pain and her lessons, she found a sense of purpose she hadn't expected. It wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about healing, and it was about breaking the cycle of trauma that had been passed down to so many of them. She didn't have all the answers, but the small steps she took to help others began to fill the void she had been left with. Helping them made her feel like she wasn't entirely lost. It reminded her that she could still do something good, even after everything that had happened. Eventually, after serving her sentence, Maya was released from prison. The world outside had changed in the years she had been away. People had moved on with their lives, but for Maya, everything felt different. She was no longer the young, eager officer who had joined the force. She had been stripped of her badge, her career, her identity. But she was still here, still breathing, still standing. The first place she went was back home to her mother's house. It wasn't much, just a modest apartment in a quieter part of the city, but it was a sanctuary. Her mother, once the pillar of strength for Maya, greeted her with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The distance between them had grown during Maya's time in prison, but seeing her daughter home, in one piece, brought tears to her eyes. Maya's reunion with her family was bittersweet. Her mother was proud that she had survived prison, but she also couldn't ignore the fact that Maya's past choices had led her here. There were many hard conversations between them, talks about mistakes, about forgiveness, about rebuilding trust. Maya realized that, while her mother had been through her own hardships, she had never resorted to vengeance. Her mother's ability to forgive, to move forward without the burden of hate, was something Maya admired deeply, and something she had to learn to embrace herself. As Maya rebuilt her life, she started to work with local organizations that supported survivors of abuse and helped former offenders reintegrate into society. She became an advocate for those who had been victims of power, manipulation, and violence. She spoke at support groups, helped mentor troubled youth, and worked alongside those who shared her vision of breaking the cycles of violence that had plagued both her life and the lives of countless others. Through this work, Maya came to understand that true strength wasn't in revenge. It wasn't about destroying someone to make yourself feel better. True strength, she realized, was in surviving the storm, in rebuilding after everything had been torn down. It was in helping others find their way, in showing them that despite the darkness they had endured, there was still hope. There was still a chance for something better. As Maya looked out over the horizon from her apartment, she knew that she would never forget the pain, the betrayal, the abuse that had led her to this point. But she also knew that the path she was on now was hers to shape. She had made mistakes, but she wasn't defined by them. The woman she was becoming, one who had learned, struggled, and forgiven, was stronger than the woman she had once been. And that was enough. In the end, it wasn't just about seeking redemption for herself. It was about breaking the cycle of hurt, of vengeance, of power. And perhaps, in doing so, she could help others avoid the same trap she had fallen into. That was where she could find peace. Maya stood at the edge of the small park near her apartment, the cool breeze rustling through the trees, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the grass. It had been a long time since she'd felt this peaceful, standing in the quiet aftermath of everything that had happened. The weight of her past was still there, a lingering presence, but it no longer felt as suffocating. It was as if the time she had spent reflecting, healing, and helping others had allowed her to breathe again. Looking back on her journey, Maya knew she would never be able to erase the pain or the mistakes she had made, nor the consequences that had come from her decisions. But she had learned something crucial along the way. Healing doesn't come from vengeance. It doesn't come from destroying those who've wronged you, nor from dwelling in the pain of your own wounds. Healing comes from choosing to let go, from accepting what you cannot change, and learning to move forward with grace. When she had been in prison, she had longed for closure, for a sense of justice, but she realized now that true closure wasn't something that could be handed to her by a court, a prison sentence, or even the redemption of others. It came from within, from accepting her humanity, her imperfections, her suffering, and the realization that she was worthy of peace, despite everything. Over the years, Maya had built something new from the rubble of her past, a life grounded in purpose. She had returned to her mother's side, healed the rift between them, and started to rebuild the relationships that had been damaged. Through the volunteer work and the organization she had aligned herself with, she had found a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just helping others, she was helping herself. Every story she heard from the people she worked with, stories of survival, of loss, and of redemption, taught her something new about the strength of the human spirit. One of the young women Maya mentored, a victim of abuse and manipulation, had once come to her, trembling with fear, convinced she couldn't escape the toxic world she had been living in. Maya had shared her own story with her, and something about that had broken through the young woman's walls. That moment, when Maya had seen someone else choose a different path, a path of healing, had been one of the most powerful of her life. It was then that Maya realized, redemption wasn't about making up for the past. It was about making a new future. Now, standing in the fading light of evening, Maya closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to simply be. The world felt vast and uncertain, but she no longer feared it. She was no longer a prisoner to her past mistakes, nor to the anger that had once driven her every action. She had taken responsibility for what she had done, and though the scars of her journey would always remain, they were no longer a source of shame. They were a part of her story, a story of pain, yes, but also one of growth, survival, and ultimate redemption. Maya didn't need anyone's approval anymore. She had forgiven herself, and that was the only approval she needed. The future ahead of her was unwritten, and while there were still shadows from her past that lingered, she understood now that it was her choice how to walk forward. Her past didn't define her anymore. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Maya smiled softly, her heart finally light. She had learned that true strength didn't lie in vengeance, in power, or in dominance. It lay in choosing to rise above the wounds, to heal, and to find a way to be a better person, no matter how many times the world tried to break you. And as she walked away from the park, towards a new life she was building, Maya knew that her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun.